So for this next demo, I'm going to mock up just a real quick fueling mechanic or a fuel burn mechanic. And in order to do this, I'm going to go back to my original rocket setup, and I'll deactivate the balloon object so just that we can focus on this rocket for a moment. So I'm going to turn off these widgets inside Playmaker. So if I go into the preferences, somewhere in here, state labels turned off. Let me turn off that that scene gizmo there so we don't see those icons popping up. I gotta correct the player camera because right now this player follow in the previous presentation we were getting the position of balloon, and I want to set that back to rocket, and probably more appropriately, and not probably, I mean most appropriately, this would dynamically find the player object. Imagine if you know, kind of outside the scope of this project, but if you had different models or different players even, and your camera needed to adopt the player object, you would want to find the active player object. So you could potentially, you know, have a empty game object that is player that swaps out its models, or you could even have different player objects that appear in the game for one reason or another, and this camera could find it. And you would do that probably, you know, the best way to, on a kind of a local level, is to create an init state for the camera to find the active player object. But for now, we're just going to manually point this back to Rocket 2, the parent object here. And so now this camera is going to track the X position of the rocket. And so I'll just test that really quickly. A little too close for the gameplay style of this rocket, but you can see that now I have some basic control here. And we'll add some visual effects to this a little bit later, but I do want to correct, kind of take a wider view here. I'll move this up just a little bit, and that's kind of more of the view, just looking at the preview down here. So back to my rocket. Now, I'm not going to play with the rocket torque just yet, but I will tweak some things a little bit later about the torque that I didn't really like what was going. Just want to refine a little bit more, but I want to go back to the thrust. And right now we have this simple mechanic where it's mouse up, mouse down. This could be, you know, whatever kind of input you want, but it's not testing to see if we have fuel. Now there's a number of ways that we could mock up this mechanic, but I'm going to just kind of start with a very simple solution, which is to check to see what our fuel value is. And so I'm going to create a variable that's going to operate on a scale of 0 to 100, and this will represent our fuel. We'll then translate that to a fuel bar. Because I potentially want to refuel, and if we, you know, think back to previous projects about how we handled player health, so that we don't get, so we don't complicate things by having to target specific variables on game objects, which is the most appropriate thing to do. We're going to take the easy way out, and we're going to create a global variable, and the global variable is going to be a float, because we want this float to respond to different game objects, and that's why we're making it global. And I'm going to call this player underscore fuel. Remember, variables always start with lowercase. Never really want to use spaces, so I'm going to use underscore. So I have a player fuel, and we'll add that. Oh, I don't want to search. What am I doing? Typing in the search field. I don't want to do that. I want to go to new variable, and I want to call this player underscore float. And I'll hit add. And so we'll say OK. We now have a global variable. Its default value right now, we're going to leave that set to 0 for now, meaning that we have no fuel, and we'll make sure that we can mock this up and make sure that we ignore our thrust if our fuel is 0. So we're in the idle state, and what we'll do is we'll pass this to a third state, kind of right in between, and we'll call this the fuel check state. And so when we press our mouse down, we'll pass it to fuel check, and if we have fuel, we'll go to thrust. If we don't have fuel, we'll just pass it back to idle, or pass it back somewhere else to wait before we reset back to idle. And so we can do this with a simple float compare. So on the fuel check state, I'm going to go to math, and inside math there should be, that's where we should find float compare. Maybe not. I don't see it in here, so maybe it's under logic. Of course, we can always search for this, but I'm just trying to remind myself. There it is, float compare. And so we're comparing two floats, right? And these are hard values right now, but one of them we want to set as the variable. And the variable that we're we're checking against is our global player float. Why did I name that player float? I don't want that to be called player float. I want that to be called player fuel. So let me just jump back into global variables. I'll select that, and you can see that I can't really rename that. It's one of the downsides of global variables. So what I'm going to do, because I caught that, I'm just going to trash that and say yes, I no longer have that variable. And we'll do this fuel. There we go. Player fuel. It's a float. It's 0 for now. And I'll close global variables. So I'll come back to fuel check and go into globals, and there's player fuel. And because I have debug turned on, I can see the current value. Now we're checking float 1, which we're looking at player fuel, against a hard value of float 2. And so what we can do is we can ask ourselves, if player fuel is equal to 0, then where should we go? Well, we need to create a couple of different events. And we could do this from this Playmaker drop-down menu and create a new event, but particularly when we're talking about multiple events, I really like to do this in the Events tab. And we could say that we have fuel, or and we don't have fuel, or we can say can thrust or can't thrust, whatever the logic is, but we want two different events that branch from this fuel check. So I'll come back to this state, and I'll just right-click and add these as transitions. If we don't have fuel, and we have fuel, so if we have fuel, we can thrust. Okay, and if we don't have fuel, I'll just wire this back to the idle state. So we got this little check here. We haven't satisfied the requirements over here, but basically the logic is whenever we press our input button, our thrust button, we pass over to fuel check to say, okay, player fuel, let's check against 0. And if it's equal to 0, we don't have fuel. Okay, so we go back to idle, or we can't thrust. If it's less than 0, we'll just catch for that. It's the same thing. We don't have any fuel, so we go back to idle. We can't go to thrust. But if it's greater than 0, we should be able to. We have fuel, and therefore we can go to the thrust state. Okay? So now we don't need to check every frame, because right now the logic is that the only time we're going to pass through here is when we push the button, in this case the get mouse down, it'll pass us through the fuel check. So we don't need to check, in this state, we don't need to check this float compare every frame, because the only way we're going to get here is when we try to thrust in the first place. And so because the default value of my fuel is set to 0, and because we've set this logic up, we should not be able to thrust. And so if I click my left mouse, you can see that it's looping back to idle. It's not doing it's not allowing us to thrust. Okay, and we can manually check against this if we go to variables, and we go to global variables, and we take our player fuel, and we just bump that value up. Let's bump it up to 100. That will be our maximum. Now I'll hit the play button, and because our fuel is not equal to 0, we can thrust. Okay? So we have this fuel value that we're checking against, whether we're greater than, equal to, or less than 0. And that seems to be working out pretty well. Now we want to burn fuel while we're thrusting, and that's just a simple matter of subtracting while we're in, from our player fuel while we're in this thrust state. And so this get mouse button up on my thrust state is doing exactly what I want it to do. It causes it to reset, so I'll just collapse that. We're adding force. Later I'll come back around, and this, the force that we're adding on the y-axis is the power that is propelling the rocket upwards. And this we might want as a variable, because that could be something that maybe we collect some power-ups somewhere. But for debugging purposes and for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to leave that value hardwired, but I'll collapse that action. Now what we'll do is I'm going to jump into the math category, or we could search for this, but I just want to do a float. Now I want to do a float modification of some way. I'm going to do a float add in this case, but there are some other options. We could do a float subtract, but I'm just going to add a negative, which will be the same thing as float subtract. So I'm going to double click float add, and the float that we want to add to is global variables, player fuel, and I'm going to add a negative value. And I'll just say something like -1. Okay, and we're going to do that every frame per second. So while we're in the thrust state, for every second that we're in the thrust state, our fuel value is going to go down. So that gives us 100 seconds basically of time of fuel. So in fact, for the sake of the demo, let me bump this up. We'll burn 10 parts of fuel per second, so we can run out of fuel pretty fast. Now, I don't have this in a heads-up display anywhere, but I can debug this because when I'm in the thrust state, I'm looking over here and I can see that my fuel rate is dropping. And if I can get this to drop fast enough, eventually I'm going to burn this down to 0, and then my fuel check should kick in, and I should say, nope, I don't have any fuel. And so had I not set the fuel to 100, or had I bumped up that fuel burn rate, we would have got there a little bit faster. But now you can see we burned down to 0, and therefore I'm out of fuel, and I can't thrust because my fuel is no longer greater than 0. Okay, now there was a little bit of a glitch in this, and actually I'm going to bump this up temporarily so we burn 50 parts of fuel per second. So now we can only fly for 2 seconds, which is great for debugging, right? Because I want to get this down to 0 pretty quickly, right? So I still didn't get down to 0, but eventually I will. Okay, and so now I'm down to 0. But you may have noticed that we don't check right now. We're currently not checking in our thrust state. So as long as we can burn our fuel down less than 0, but until we go back to idle, we never go back through this fuel check. So what we want to do is, in addition, on this thrust state, we'll also do a float compare. So this time around, I'll just search for float compare. I'll hit return to add, and I'm going to set up the exact same setup that I did in the previous state. Now, I could copy this action and paste it over here, and it would work just the same. I still need to add the transition action, but it's going to be a little bit different here. And the reason it's going to be a little bit different is we're still going to check player fuel. We're going to check it against 0. And we don't need a greater than check. All we really need is we want to know if it's equal to 0, then we don't have fuel. Or if it's less than 0, because I could foresee a situation where we end up in a negative value. Maybe Unity doesn't calculate the variable precisely, or we end up in a situation where it's not exactly 0. So we want equal to and less than, both, to say we don't have any fuel. And we want to check against this one every frame. So as long as we're in the thrust state, we're constantly checking that our value of fuel, we're checking against this variable here, against whether it's equal to or less than. Okay, so now the only thing left to do, we're getting scolded here because we're saying if it's less than or equal to 0, then fire off this don't have fuel event, and we don't have that added as a transition over here. So I'm going to add the transition don't have fuel, and we'll pass this back to idle. Okay, so it goes to the same place as if we're releasing the mouse. The only difference is it's triggered once fuel is at or less than 0. Okay, so we'll test this and see if this works. And because we're burning 50 parts of fuel pretty quickly, I'm just going to mash the mouse button, and you can see that it sent us over to idle pretty quickly. Okay, so we crashed to the ground this time. So now we have this working thrust mechanic. It would be helpful to be able to see that info on screen. So let me do a real quick review about how we would get our fuel numerically up on screen. And this will be just a real quick review. We'll do this with the UI system. And so we'll create a UI text element. So we get a canvas, we also get an event system, but I'm most interested in this text element. And this text element we could rename, we'll call this player fuel, in case we have some other text elements that pop up later. And we'll temporarily print current fuel, just so we get a little info on screen, so that when I jump over to the game tab, I'm looking for current fuel, typos and all, and I don't see it. There it is, down there. It's kind of hard to see. Maybe you don't see it in the projector or in the screencast. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to center this with the player fuel text selected. I'm going to go to this little widget here, this little rect transform. And remember, if we hold down Shift and Alt, I'll just set it right to the center. And so now when I go to the game, without even hitting play, I can see that I have the current fuel right in the center. And this will be good for debugging. All right, just got some info right here. If I want to offset this, I'll move the position up a little bit so it shows up in the sky. Alternatively, what I could do is in this rect transform, holding down Shift and Alt or Option, we could anchor that to the top left-hand corner of our game view. It's up there. It's kind of hard to see. And then we can offset it to the right and down a little bit. But I'm going to just center it again, because right now this is really just for debugging for now. So I can see that value. So when we play right now, we're just getting the value of our current text fuel in the middle of our screen here. But I want to convert that to actually show the value of fuel. And so in this case, we would probably want to set up some kind of a fuel manager. To cut to the chase, I'm just going to add this to the camera. So I'm going to find the player camera, and right now we have a state machine. It's currently the player follow, and so maybe I'll take that title off and just leave it FSM for now. And this state will do a couple of different things. It's getting the position of the player and setting the camera position, but maybe we should also use this state here to render the value of the player fuel text. So what I want to do is I want to drag into this state. I want to do a set property of player fuel. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I have the player camera state machine selected. I'm just going to lock this state machine, and what that allows me to do is go to the player fuel text. So I can look at the inspector here, and I can drag this text element directly into my camera state. Okay, when I release it, and for some reason mine is popping up in the bottom left-hand corner, hopefully yours is popping up right over here where it should, I'm going to set property. So our camera is setting the property of player fuel, and the property that we want to set is this text field string. And so I'm looking for something. There's text. We want to set the string of the text to something, and the value we want to set it to, we want to take our float value and convert it so that we can print it to screen. And I'll want to do this every frame. So we don't want to set this to a hard value that we type in. We want to set this to a variable. And we don't have a string variable set up, so I'll just set this up really quickly. And this is, we'll call this our fuel string. Okay. Now our fuel string, again, I'll use this same state, and we have a global variable called player fuel, but it's a float, and we can't take a float and stick it in a string field, and so we got to do a little conversion on it. And so I'm going to type in string, because there are some things that convert, and we can convert a float to a string, and that'll be useful. That's really what we want to do. So I'm going to convert the float variable. The float variable I'm most interested in is the global variable fuel. I want to see the value of fuel, and I want to convert that to our fuel string, which is being printed, setting the property in that text field. We'll do that every frame. So if we have those two actions attached to our camera, we should see the value of fuel now debugging on screen. So it's 100, and I can see it going down. Okay, and if those fractions, those decimal points there are driving you nuts, we could do a little conversion there too. I believe there's an action. We could convert a float to an integer, or an int, which by definition an int needs to be a whole number, and therefore we get rid of the decimal point there. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's I think there is a seems to me there's something that would save us set an int from a float. I guess we're doing the same thing if we're converting a float to an int. So either one of those options, we can set an int from a float, or we could do a convert float to int, and we're getting the same thing. So essentially, so we'll set this int value. I'll create a new value, and this we'll just call this fuel integer, and we'll set it from the player fuel, and we'll do that every frame. Okay, so right now we really don't need to convert our float to a string. We can deactivate that, because what we're doing is we're taking the value of our fuel, the thing that we're actually measuring, and we're converting it to an int. So now we need to convert this int to a string, and maybe there's an action that would compound this all down into one kind of more simple step, but I like kind of seeing the individual mechanics of this. So we'll take our fuel int and we'll convert that to our fuel string. We'll do that every frame, and I'll just move this action down so it's kind of a little bit more in a logical order. Now if we did all that right, we're converting an int to the same string that we're printing in our text field, and so now after all those clicks, basically what we have is we have a rounded value here now. So if you wanted to see that fuel value without the decimal point, you got it. That's it, right? Okay. So we're burning fuel. We could do a refuel mechanic, which in the next presentation we'll do a couple of different things. I'll do a simple fuel bar to show not only are we printing the value of our fuel to screen so we can see the value of it, but we can also relate that to a status bar. So as we burn fuel, our bar could get smaller. So in the heads-up display, we could build something a little bit more complex. And then, of course, we could also develop a pickup. So we pick up fuel as we go, just like we did in previous games. But we'll also create a little variation on that where, yeah, we could pick up little pickups that give us fuel, but maybe we could also land somewhere and collect fuel while we're on a refueling pad or something. And so again, we'll just kind of continue to layer these mechanics. But that's a fairly detailed overview of a burning fuel mechanic. So we'll catch up in the next presentation.